9 generations, 1,025 Pokemon, and over 40 mainline games. This is the Pokemon franchise, and today I'm going to be ranking every Pokemon game ever, from Red and Blue all the way up to Scarlet and Violet. But before we begin today, let me lay out some criteria for this video. First up, how about we discuss what I look for in a Pokemon game? It's a combination of things like story, characters, explorability, and of course the Pokemon. I don't care much for things like the competitive meta, so don't expect me to talk about that aspect very much in this ranking. Next, I want to clarify that twin release games will share a spot on this ranking video, but sequels or enhanced games will be separate. By that, I mean games like Gold and Silver will count for one spot on this list, but Crystal will get its own entry. And last and most important of all, remember, the rankings are only my opinion. I guarantee my list will be different from yours, because we all have things we like, dislike, and are even nostalgic for. So be sure to keep that in mind during this video, and also be sure to drop your rankings in the comment section below. Alright then, let's get right into it. In dead last is none other than Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Hopefully this one doesn't come off as much as a surprise to many of you, because these games are infamously hated across most of the fandom. The Sinnoh region, and by extension Diamond and Pearl, were quite beloved by essentially everyone, but the region was definitely in need of a modern update, and we didn't really get that at all. The Sinnoh remakes were long awaited and very highly anticipated, and the second Pokemon revealed what direction they were going in, I hated them instantly. If Pokemon were to do something like they did with ORAS with these games, I have no doubt they would have been some of the best entries in the entire franchise. Imagine something like Primal Forms for Dialga and Palkia, or even something like a Distortion World update for the Switch. But unfortunately we got none of that, and instead we got stuck with faithful remakes. I am able to find at least a little good in every entry on this ranking, except for these two games. If you ask me, there is no reason to ever play these, and it really bums me out because I love the Sinnoh region, but this just felt like a major cash grab on Pokemon's part. I mean, Game Freak didn't even work on these games themselves. Instead, they just outsourced programming to Ilka, and while I don't mean any real hate towards them, these games were obviously too big for the small production company, so that's why there's so many bugs and glitches scattered throughout. In short, these games suck. The second worst games Pokemon have to offer is Sword and Shield. Wow, Pokemon really did put out some stinkers during the 8th generation. So Pokemon was basically Nintendo's last major franchise to make the jump from the 3DS to the Switch. But in the fall of 2019, Pokemon was finally coming to home console with Pokemon Sword and Shield. But before these games were even released, there was loads of controversy and hate thanks to things like graphics and of course, Dexit. Then the games came out, and they were kinda just underwhelming. While I do think that they introduced some great new Pokemon, the game itself just felt very unpolished. And worst of all was that story. Actually, no. Worst of all was the DLC. I am not a big fan of Pokemon DLC, and that's mostly because of the price. The Sword and Shield games retailed for $60 a piece, and then to buy the full DLC expansion pass, it was an additional $30. So if you wanted to fully experience the Galar region in its entirety with both versions, it's gonna set you back a whopping $180. And the big problem is I just don't think the games merit that price. I am able to appreciate some parts of the game though. The gym battles are pretty epic, and that music is among the best in the franchise. I am a little indifferent about the Gigantamax gimmick though. While most of the designs are actually really good, it lacks in comparison to things like Megas or even Z moves. If these games would have only gotten an extra year of development, they could have honestly been great entries. The potential and pieces were there, but unfortunately it just falls flat. Next, we've got the original Pokemon games, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. And I guess if you're from Japan, Pokemon Green. Now I gotta begin this entry by of course stating, without these games, the Pokemon franchise just wouldn't exist. They introduced the iconic original 151 Pokemon and kicked off Pokemania. So of course I must recognize them and their place in gaming history. But guys, these games kinda suck. I wasn't even born when these games came out, so I don't really have any nostalgia for them. And remember, the story of the original games aren't great, and the art, more specifically, the sprites of some Pokemon, are absolutely gross. There's also just a ton of glitches and goofs to be found throughout the game, but I'd actually argue that these glitches make the games that much better. Things like Missing Note and the X accuracy glitch actually lead to a ton of fun ways to play. And of course, I must recognize things like the old Mew under the truck or Pokegods rumors. These were the legends of old playground talk, and they helped start so many lifelong friendships. These games, of course, did go on to become the highest selling Game Boy games of all time, and they're definitely some of the most iconic games ever. I just kind of find them to be bland and borderline unplayable. Now we've got the Sun and Moon games. I do have some major respect for these games, as I can't help but admire the ambition the developers had when it comes to the Alola region. I mean, for 6 whole generations, the story was more or less the same. Battle the 8 gym leaders and then go on to face the Elite Four and ultimately the champion. But Sun and Moon threw out the old Pokemon formula. The new Trials and Totem Pokemon system were actually pretty cool, and some of the challenges were actually very tough. The biggest problem with these games, though, is the speed and handholdiness. I'm sure you've heard it before, but these games are littered with long, unskippable cutscenes and kind of some stupid and useless tasks. It's because of this that I find these games almost unreplayable. Like seriously, I was able to play these games once, and I refused to do another playthrough. Meanwhile, other things like the map really drag this game down too. For being 4 tropical islands, the map is incredibly linear and leave very little room for any extra exploring. And I guess I should touch on Z-moves. I don't mind them. While yes, they certainly aren't as powerful or impressive as something like a Mega Evolution, the element of surprise is a major pro, seeing how any Pokemon can use them. But I do think most of the animations just take way too long. Finally, for this entry, I'll touch on the Pokemon introduced here in Sun and Moon. Unfortunately, Alola didn't add a ton of new Pokemon, and they were all quite polarizing. We've got some great Pokemon like Mimikyu and the Tapus, but we've also got some terrible ones like Bruxish and Crabominable. And we're going back to Generation 1 here with Pokemon Yellow. Now, with Pokemon Yellow, pretty much every criticism I have about Pokemon Red and Blue still apply here, but there's just so much more charm with Pokemon Yellow. The game pulls heavy inspiration from the anime. In this game, the player character can only choose a Pikachu as your starter, and that Pikachu stays out of its Pokeball and follows you around, just like Ash Ketchum's in the anime. You also get the opportunity to use all 3 Kanto starters here, which is a very welcome addition. The concept here was stupendous, and I wish Pokemon could have stuck with it. The game also offers a great challenge early on, as we must go up against Brock, with Pikachu likely being your only usable Pokemon. Overall, I think Pokemon Yellow is a very underrated gem. It is certainly the best way to play through the Generation 1 games. And back to Alola we go with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Now these Ultra games are supposed to be viewed as sequel games similar to Black 2 and White 2, but they definitely don't achieve that to the same effect. I actually view both of these games as an enhanced version, but instead of making it a single Pokemon game like Pokemon Eclipse, they made it into 2 Ultra games cause, you know, money. I do view these Ultra games, though, to be the definitive way to play through the Alola region. It's just as slow and just as handholdy as the base games, but the enhancements and tweaks actually make this game pretty solid. Things like new Z-moves, fixed evolution methods, and access to more Pokemon makes for a much more pleasant experience. And then major changes like the Rainbow Rocket Arc, Ultra Space Adventures, and the new Necrozma storyline greatly enhance the Alolan playthrough. But I can't deny how unnecessary these games feel. If the base Sun and Moon games were just this, minus those cutscenes, I have no doubt that the 7th generation would have been very widely adored. And just like that, we're already back in Kanto for the 3rd time in this video. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee are certainly Pokemon games, but there really isn't much to them. Do they take risks? No. Is it the best way to play through Kanto? No. It's boring. It cuts some awesome pre-established Kanto locations, like the Sevi Islands, and overall, it's kinda just boring. Also, don't even get me started on that major downgrade of a rival we have in Trace. I understand these games were made to help draw in the casual Pokemon Go players, and I guess it would be a solid introduction to the series, but it doesn't really do anything all that special. It's not all bad with these games though. I appreciated how seamlessly they were able to bridge the gap between this game and the Pokemon Go app. Plus, I also really admire how they introduced Melton and Melmetal. And I of course appreciate the addition of Mega Evolutions. And finally, I think these games actually look really great, and are bursting with some beautiful colors. Pokemon Gold and Silver are exactly what a good sequel should do. It took what was great about the first games and expanded on it. I mean, nowhere is this more evident than in the map itself. The Johto games are always praised for having 2 playable regions, but I can't help but feel as if both of these regions feel somewhat lacking in substance. Like, by the time you get to Kanto, it's basically just run through each gym till you can head up to Mount Silver. But these games have held up much better over the years than Red and Blue. There are way less glitches and goofs in these games, and they offer much smoother playthroughs. We also got loads of charming improvements to the series, like the day and night cycle, breeding, a non-linear map, and best of all, 2 awesome new types to help balance battles. Gold and Silver introduced 100 new Pokemon into the series, and well, most of them are actually pretty bad, some are actually really good, and a few of them are even great. But unfortunately, many of these Pokemon like Houndoom, Tyranitar, and Scizor are either locked away to the post-game or need a trade evolution. This just doesn't make sense to me. But I must commend Gold and Silver for adding substantial lore and story to the series. In the Kanto games, it was mostly just about Team Rocket and Mewtwo. But now in Gold and Silver, we got lore on things like the Unknown, the legendary beasts, Ho-Oh, Lugia, Celebi, and even the entire Johto region itself. And finally, Pokemon Gold and Silver created likely the most iconic battle in Pokemon history, and that of course being the climactic battle with Red atop Mount Silver. I view the 4th generation of Pokemon as the best gen in the entire series. This is when the Pokemon series was hitting its full stride, and it all started here with Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. These games took Pokemon lore and story and turned it up to a 10. I mean, we literally got introduced to the gods of the Pokemon world. The legendaries and mythicals introduced here in Sinnoh were plentiful and maybe even a bit too much. But pretty much all of them, except for you, are great and iconic. Diamond and Pearl introduced loads of awesome new Pokemon. I mean, we got Pokemon like Infernape, Garchomp, Lucario, and Staraptor, who are some of the most beloved Pokemon of all time. These games even gave old, weak Pokemon new impressive evolutions. Gliscor, Electivire, and Weavile are some of my favorites. But what was most impressive about these games was the Wi-Fi accessibility. One of the main themes of Pokemon was always trading with others, but up until Diamond and Pearl, we were crippled by a link cable. But now, with the power of Wi-Fi, someone located in America could trade with anyone in the whole world. And I absolutely love the idea of the global trading system, even though there were some crazy trade requests. There's just so much to love about these games. I haven't even brought up awesome characters like Cynthia or the gym leaders. I didn't even mention new features like the Underground. And I didn't even mention the physical special split, arguably the most important mechanic change in Pokemon history. But a lot of the nostalgia for Gen 4 actually comes from Pokemon Platinum. The Diamond and Pearl games themselves are actually kinda rough to play through. The speed of these games are brutally slow. The regional Pokedex is actually quite awful, and the story is incomplete and the pacing is way off. These games certainly help set the table for an awesome new generation of Pokemon on the DS, but they certainly were very flawed. In 12th place, we find the latest addition to the series with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. With these games being the 2nd generation on the Switch, many were expecting these games to be much more polished and buttoned up than the likes of Sword and Shield, but that was certainly not the case. These games were scattered with bugs and glitches upon release. But of all the modern Pokemon games, I find myself having some of the most fun I've ever had in all of Pokemon with these 2 entries. The new open world aspect of these games are pulled off relatively well, and the characters here in Paldea are actually pretty memorable. And I actually found these games to be surprisingly challenging. But unfortunately, there are still a lot of bad things here in these games. Level scaling is not a thing, which cripples the open world concept. The music is forgettable, and the game can lag badly at times. Oh, and finally, I found Team Star to be absolutely dreadful. Maybe the worst evil team in all of Pokemon. Finally, these games introduce some great new Pokemon. I love just about every Paradox Pokemon, and the likes of Ceruledge, Palafin, and Annihilape are all awesome. I want to end this entry by stating this. These games are good, just a bit unpolished. Another year or even just an additional 6 months of development could have made these games an easy 9 out of 10, or possibly even a perfect 10. Pokemon Crystal took what was great about Gold and Silver and added to it, which is exactly what the 3rd version enhanced game should do. It of course though is still able to have its own identity with the likes of a new storyline focused all around Suicune. One of the biggest things Pokemon Crystal did was allowed women to play the game of Pokemon. The addition of Chris to the Pokemon franchise was a major change to the series, and now gender selection is something that has been used in every game since. These games even added small slice-of-life details that make the game much more enjoyable. Updated and moving sprites, updated map designs, and some more catchable Pokemon. If you're gonna play through a Gen 2 Johto game, it should definitely be Pokemon Crystal. Now on to Hoenn we go with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. These games really help take Pokemon into a bold new direction. The Hoenn region and its Pokemon really aim to differentiate itself from the closely related Kanto and Johto regions. The advent of these games also brought new mechanics like double battles, natures, and abilities, mechanics that have been staples of the franchise ever since. I'd also argue that the Hoenn games introduced the best new group of Pokemon in the entire franchise. The starters are all easily 10 out of 10s, the legendaries are among the best in the franchise, and we got 2 absolutely awesome pseudo-legendaries. Meanwhile, all the other Pokemon are all natural and fitting to the new semi-tropical Hoenn region. The only big problem I have with these games, though, is the post-game. It's very underwhelming. While this has become very common now in modern games, these games stuck out like a sore thumb back in the day, especially because they came out right after the Gen 2 games. Not really all that exciting, but still pretty good games all the same. Now let's make the jump into full 3D with Pokemon X and Y. Now X and Y are actually pretty divisive games among the franchise. Many view the games to be a bit too easy, a bit too lazy, and a bit forgettable. And while I'll admit some of those criticisms are fair, I actually have a ton of nostalgia for these games. Sure, they're easy, especially if you use one of these, but they're just so charming. The characters and their designs all really rock and stand out. Trainer customization was a long overdue addition, and I found myself spending countless hours roller skating through Lumiose. But X and Y introduced a ton of new major features to the series, the biggest of course being the jump to full 3D with every Pokemon receiving new models. Because of this, it should come as not much of a surprise that Kalos introduced the fewest new Pokemon ever to the series. But, most of them are great. All of these Pokemon here are epic and great new additions to the series. And of course, Kalos introduced Megas, the most beloved battling gimmick in all of Pokemon. Mega Evolution took weak Pokemon and gave them major battle upgrades and oftentimes an epic design. I know I said I wouldn't really discuss competitive battling for this video, but I think it was at its best here in X and Y. Megas, abilities, and EV training were all peak here, and the PSS interface was the best in all of Pokemon. Yeah, the champion was easy, the evil team was dumb, and there weren't many new Pokemon added to the series, but that's okay. I still really admire these games, and I'm excited to head back to Kalos in the near future. The first Pokemon remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, claim the 8th spot here. Now, I'll begin this entry by saying this. These games are the best way to play through Kanto. There's just so much to admire about these games. The sprites and artwork are all beautiful here, the games run so smooth, and everything is much more balanced this time around in Kanto. The remakes flawlessly pulled off a modern tune-up to the original games. While we are still just limited to the original 151 Mons during the main campaign, many older Pokemon become more usable with these new mechanics, stats, and type changes. These games are also decently challenging. With the exception of Bruno, the entire Elite Four is one of the hardest in all of Pokemon, and that champion battle with Blue is incredibly tough. The post-game is also pretty solid. We got full access to the Sevi Islands, and even a couple short side quests to achieve there, while also gaining access to some new Johto Pokemon. And of course, that battle with Mewtwo in Cerulean Cave is as epic as ever. Now on to Black and White. When the Generation 5 games were first introduced, I was a major hater. These games were basically soft reboots onto the series, and I just was simply not interested. But then, years later, I gave these games a chance, and I absolutely loved them. So if you aren't able to figure it out by now, I really respect a Pokemon game that takes risks. And these Black and White games are undoubtedly the biggest risk in Pokemon history. These games made the bold decision to basically do away with every previous Pokemon and force us to use the new 156 Unova Pokemon. And while yes, some of these Pokemon are pretty goofy, most are amazing. Haxorus, Scrafty, and Braviary are some of my favorite Pokemon ever, and I could go on and on. But When it comes to discussing the Pokemon of Unova, I feel as if when it comes to legendaries and mythicals, they went way too overboard. I'm just not a fan of the likes of Meloetta and the Swords of Justice. But of course the best part of these games is the story. This was the first time a Pokemon game actually made us think. Team Plasma and its philosophy actually made sense, and there will never be a character quite as good as N. These games are jam-packed with both ambition and content. Of recent years, the Pokemon series had become stale, but then came Pokemon Legends Arceus to add a great new exciting spin to the series. I fell in love with this game instantly. Now this was a fitting game for the home console, and honestly, Legends Arceus saved the 8th generation of Pokemon. Legends Arceus has a totally unique battling system, and the addition of agile and strong style moves were actually pretty fun. But battling really isn't the main focus of these games. The story and exploration of Ancient Hisui is probably some of the best in all of Pokemon. The lore of Sinnoh was already some of the most interesting in the whole series, and we got to learn even more about it here. Many new mechanics are introduced here in these games that are specific to only it, such as crafting, new ride Pokemon, and an awesome new capturing mechanic. The roster of usable Pokemon here is among the smallest in the entire series, but that's not necessarily all that bad. As I said earlier, battling isn't all that important here, and they introduced some awesome new Hisuian forms and evolutions. I know for this entry I kept saying battling isn't all that important, but the climactic match between Volo and his Giratina is actually one of the toughest battles in all of Pokemon. Legends Arceus is certainly not without its faults though. Some of the textures and graphics feel sloppy, and of course this game has a fair amount of bugs. And I also found the beginning sequences of this game to be an absolute bore to get through. But I still believe everyone should give this game a try, and I'm so excited for more Legends games. Heart Gold and Soul Silver come in strong at 5th place on today's list. Now you may be a bit surprised by this spot, seeing as many view this to be the greatest Pokemon games of all time. But I don't. I still of course think they are amazing though. So these games probably have the most content a Pokemon game has ever had. It would take me a long time to discuss every single new feature, but how about I just rapid fire a few here? We got following Pokemon, the Pokemon Triathlon, the Pokewalker, some epic mystery gift events, loads of real-time based events, gym leader rematches, and the Battle Frontier. All of these led to hours upon hours of extra gameplay. In these games, the Johto region really comes to life with the new modern DS systems. I still find these Lugia and Ho-Oh cutscenes to be visually stunning. So you're probably asking why these games only rank as 5th on today's list. Well, yes, they did introduce loads of awesome new features and enhancements. They didn't really fix many of the problems that were within the Gen 2 games themselves. They didn't fix the awkward level curve, the Kanto region still feels a bit barren, and worst of all, they did not fix the weird placement of some prominent Johto Pokemon. But I still can't understate how amazing these games are. You can really tell how much thought and care went into development, and they will always set the curve for what a good Pokemon remake looks like. They just aren't the best though. The best Pokemon remakes are Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. These games took the normal remake formula and totally threw it out the window. Yes, they used the base Ruby and Sapphire games as the main foundation, but these bring so much more to the table. The ORAS games dial the Hoenn region up to an extra notch of epicness. We got loads of new, awesome, and powerful megas. We got an awesome Rayquaza post-game storyline that takes us to space to face Deoxys. And we got the Dex Nav, which might be the best way to hunt Pokemon ever. And that's not even to mention the new soaring mechanic, which is definitely the best way to traverse in all of Pokemon. The mysterious rings to capture legendaries may have been a bit lazy as far as a storytelling standpoint, but it was honestly so fun to get to explore these extra areas and capture powerful Pokemon. Okay, are these games challenging? No, not really. Especially if you use an OP Mega. But I did find Steven Stone to be very tough, so I guess it was a bit tougher than X and Y. And again, I'll say during the Gen 6 era was when I believe competitive Pokemon was at its best. Now, I think these games would be absolutely 100% perfect, and the best games in all of Pokemon if the Battle Frontier postgame was in these games. I mean, they really tease us like it's actually coming, but now, 10 years later, I'm still waiting for construction on it to finish. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 take the bronze medal for the best Pokemon games ever. These games followed the common trend of being bold in Unova by being Pokemon's first ever sequel games. These allow for the story of Unova to be much better as it's able to use and expand on pre-established plot points. But they also bring Pokemon back to its previous roots by bringing back some older mons from the past 4 generations. Beyond just the Pokemon, the areas and maps are also expanded and enhanced. Many of the older areas from the first games have received renovations and makeovers. We also got some unique new mechanics like hidden grottos, the challenge game mode, and arguably my favorite of all time, animated sprites. These sprites did so much for me, honestly, and they gave these Pokemon a ton of character and personality. But what I think makes these games so much better than their predecessors is the post-game. The biggest attraction here is the Pokemon World Tournament, which you can spend hours team building and battling previous iconic characters. There's also a fair chunk of decent mythical and legendary events, and there's loads of awesome NPC super bosses to challenge. I would also argue that this was the last great post-game in Pokemon history. Pokemon Platinum is the second best Pokemon game of all time. It's the best way to play through the Sinnoh region, and honestly, it may just be the ultimate Pokemon game. When you think back to the Sinnoh region and what makes it great, these memories definitely come from this game. First and foremost, the gameplay is much smoother and much more enjoyable than in the base Diamond and Pearl games, as it speeds up many of the slow-moving aspects. Meanwhile, that brutal Pokedex from DP got fixed to include every new Sinnoh Pokemon and some older favorites. I know Flint and Volkner were happy about that. The story is much more epic here, as the Pokemon equivalent of the Devil takes the center stage, and the Distortion World is probably the coolest location in all of Pokemon. Meanwhile, Cyrus's plans and Cynthia's involvement in this story are much more fleshed out, and of course, that makes for a much more enticing narrative. The climactic battle with Cynthia is just as good as ever, and thanks to her updated team, some new graphics, and a level curve, the battle is just that much better. The new features here are perfect. We got a few new forms for legendaries and mythicals, and speaking of mythicals, all of those awesome mythical side quests you remember, they were all Platinum exclusives. The post-game in Platinum is amazing. It created a new version of the Battle Frontier, which is a bit smaller than Hoenn's, but still great. But we also got to access the survival area and the resort area, which actually pose quite a bit of a challenge with powerful trainers and some entertaining side quests. This game is nearly perfect, and it would be the greatest game in Pokemon history if it weren't for... But the greatest Pokemon game ever is Pokemon Emerald. Charm, nostalgia, and perfection. I could literally make an hour-long documentary about what I love about Pokemon Emerald and what makes it so perfect. The Hoenn region has been and always will be my favorite region, but it always felt like something was missing in the base Ruby and Sapphire games. But Pokemon Emerald fixes essentially every problem with Ruby and Sapphire. The story in Emerald is much better, and actually makes a fair amount of sense this time around. The challenge in Emerald is much tougher, seeing how basically every gym leader adds new and powerful Pokemon to their teams. And, I mean, Rayquaza is literally the best legendary in all of Pokemon, and his big cutscene still gives me chills. Some other upgraded features include the return of animated sprites, gym leader rematches, graphic upgrades, new areas, and a bunch more double battles. Where Pokemon Emerald thrives, though, is in its post-game. The Safari Zone opens up a new area filled with Johto Pokemon. Some worth noting are Houndour, Mareep, and even Wooper, among many others. But there's also a ton of awesome mystery gift events, which, thanks to glitches and bugs, can still be accessed to this very day. But we all know the best feature of Emerald is the Battle Frontier. So many people love the Battle Frontier, and they pray it returns in basically every new Pokemon game. It greatly adds to the replayability of this game, because, well, it's still super hard. To achieve some of these Frontier symbols, you have to win ridiculous amounts of battles in a row, only to face off with a powerful Frontier brain that always seems to have RNG on their side. Between the gym leader upgrades and Battle Frontier, Pokemon Emerald is likely the hardest game in the whole franchise. Mix all of that in with a wide variety of great Pokemon offered in this game, along with the natural charm of the Hoenn region and its decent story, and that's the formula for the greatest Pokemon game ever. So, here it is, my official tier rankings for every main series Pokemon game ever. Well guys, that's gonna do it. This is my ranking of every Pokemon game ever. Remember though, it was only my opinion, and be sure to let me know what your rankings are in the comments below. Thanks guys, and please drop a like if you enjoyed, and have a good one.